Welcome to the first edition of the Populist Papers, where rogues and scoundrels gather unlimited motivation and vitality as we beseech the invisible chiefs to help guide you on a journey of subterranean enchantment where the elixir vitae awaits your indulgence.
Okay, we are live in the studio. I am your host, Colin Kramer, a professor of speech and debate that has come to see how independent thinking, ritual magic, and a mutual investigation into the truth can help transform Homo sapien into Homo evolutus and usher in a brand new eon of enlightenment, alliance, and self-sufficiency, which hopefully will bring an end to corporate rule and aristocratic control in the United States. How do we manage this? Well, we infiltrate the apparatus of the establishment and overwhelm their house of constipated reason with copious amounts of provocative and unusual art, progressive populism, thoughtful coalition, and a Rosicrucian renaissance. This could trigger what some would call a paradigm shift, a mass consciousness movement, the Free Thought Project, the Age of Aquarius, the Great Awakening. But for now, we'll just call it the New Eon. And it all starts right here in the creative Commonwealth of California, the Golden State. It's not only where East meets West. It's not just a magnetic chakra blasting beams from beyond to every point on Earth. It's a golden state of mind. The same one that brought us surfing, skateboarding, and snowboarding as we know them, and happens to be the state that sets the standard for, well, almost everything, from real estate practice to environmentalism. Remember, the very first Earth Day was in Santa Barbara. And also some more obvious things like how films are made. But do you remember the old Universal Studios intro? It was the word universal in place of the equator, with an image of our favorite planet. Well, at least it's my favorite planet. I mean, maybe some of you are more into Neptune or Pluto. Is that still a dwarf planet? I don't know. Anyway, the Earth is spinning behind the Universal logo. And I don't know if any of you noticed, but the sequence begins at China and it spins toward California, where it stops. It follows the journey of civilizations through the Middle East and Great Britain, and it ends here. And that's precisely where we're at. The buck stops here. And what I want to know is if we're going to keep going around and around playing the same old game, or are we going to start something new? It's all been accumulating and escalating up to this tipping point. A crossroads for sure, which for me is both very exciting and utterly terrifying at the exact same time. I mean, on the one hand, I wonder if this is the beginning of the end. But on the other, I feel like everything is so new and so uncharted. You know, I spent several years working as a court researcher and a private investigator. I could talk about that stuff for weeks. But something that stood out was, working in the courts and everything, was just how little we've figured out as a society. In fact, every time someone crosses that little gate to enter a courtroom, they're acknowledging we don't know. And that's something that's rather unique about this nation. We admit that everything's still up in the air. Anything can happen, and you can feel it too. You can feel it. It's almost as if some kind of a divine presence is somehow using us to figure itself out. Are we co-partners with the Great Spirit? I can't say for sure yet. But I'll tell you this. If you respect peace, justice, and the American way, you are invited. And if you don't respect that stuff, then, you're still invited. Because, I'm kind of a hippie. I love everybody. And I love contrasts and open exchange, independent thinking. So join the freak show. Sign up. Hop on the magical mystery bus and help us take control of reality's steering wheel. Could be fun. It's a movement to move all movements. And I especially want to hear any bizarre ramblings from inside the nightmarish mind of a dangerous madman like me. So our emphasis will be on revolutionary West Coast activity, all through the lens of a Jewish Southern Californian from the 90s. I am a progressive with a slight libertarian streak and want nothing more than to return the United States to its Jeffersonian populist tradition, which created the most vibrant and long-lasting middle class the world has ever seen. How to achieve this? Well, we at the Populist Papers hold firm that the best way to end the gridlock of aristocratic rule and corporate excess is with an open source collective, which I call the PRI, Public Resource Initiative. It's about making the tools that we need more accessible. And it's not just a name. We are the Populist Papers. We are the public resource. And the more we all put into it, the more we can all get out of it, because we are the ones we've been waiting for. I had a strange person on the street ask me once in Echo Park. He was like, "Hey, what's the most valuable commodity on Earth?" And I thought, well, who the hell is this guy? But, I'm usually open to engage spontaneously. So I'm thinking, what is the most valuable commodity? Is it platinum? Maybe palladium? Gold? And he said, I'll never forget this. He says, "I think it's people." And my life has never been the same since. And we're all better off when we're all better off. You think we're just a bunch of monolithic, lifeless apologists for the progressive cause? Boo-boo. The goal is to create a richer public domain. And without a rich public domain, you can't really have culture. So this domain will be centered around a massive open source collective to stimulate self-empowerment, freedom of choice, and ultimately a more civilized society. Some call it copyleft instead of copyright. And Thomas Jefferson would have loved it. He said that patents should only last as long as the inventor is alive. That's it. He may not have been our greatest president, but he is, I think, the most quotable intellectual of all time. So I want to share with you a Jefferson quote about the nature of invention. Quote, "By a universal law, indeed, whatever, whether fixed or movable, belongs to all men equally and in common, is the property for the moment of him who occupies it, but when he relinquishes the occupation, the property goes with it." End quote. Jefferson goes on to say that, quote, "Ideas should freely spread from one another over the globe for the moral and mutual instruction of man and improvement of his condition, seems to have been peculiarly and benevolently designed by nature when she made them, like fire, expansible all over space, without lessening their density in any point, and like the air in which we breathe, move, and have our physical being, incapable of confinement or exclusive appropriation. Inventions then cannot, in nature, be a subject of property." End quote. That's my boy, Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to Isaac McPherson, August 13th, 1813. So TJ could be considered not only the author of the Declaration of Independence and father of the University of Virginia. Strangely, those are the only two things on his headstone. If you go check it out in Columbia, Missouri, he didn't even want his headstone to mention that he was a president of the United States. He was more proud of having founded a free college. What a guy. But on top of those other great achievements, he was basically the godfather of the open source movement. Although, using words like peculiarly, he wasn't known for being the best public speaker. He actually despised speaking in public, and he even tried to do his State of the Union addresses by letter. Can you imagine that? It'd be like, maybe Trump won't give us a State of the Union. He'll just kind of give us a series of tweets letting us know what's up. But I feel like Jefferson's point is that man is of nature. So man's ideas are also a part of nature. And that these ideas are supposed to benefit everyone instead of just making one family into billionaires, you know? So this brings us to the notion of collective ownership, the commons. I wish more people knew what the commons meant, but we haven't taught civics in public schools for decades. But basically, the citizens of a state legally own that state's resources. That's why they're called commonwealths. The Commonwealth of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Maryland. So let's talk about wealth for a sec. Wealth and power. Part of the goal of this podcast is to help people unplug from the grid in any way they can, to catalyze the reopening of the commons. We're going to be releasing documents and interviewing a lot of experts about things like how to convert your car into water power, DIY urban farming tricks, as well as exchanging tips and strategies for staying under the radar of unruly mass surveillance. And what I'm getting at here is a means of generating your own power, enough to help enforce a reverse income tax, or maybe a basic guaranteed income. It's similar to what Alaska does with their oil. And this is something that libertarians and socialists alike can really build a coalition around. The amount of solar energy in the Southwest alone could generate enough revenue to implement a universal guaranteed income, or at least a negative income tax. That's right, you'd get money from the government. And this is actually a very conservative measure. Think about it. Even Richard Nixon looked into a basic income guarantee for all Americans. Because if you look at the number, you look at the actual numbers, and if you just gave people money every year, you could abolish Social Security, unemployment, food stamps. Get rid of them. Don't need them. Because by cutting all of those administrative costs involved with maintaining these sloppy bureaucracies and departments, we'd still end up saving money. Yeah, I'm a big fan of just cutting out the middlemen, cutting through all that red tape, and just giving money away to citizens. Because it's like injecting a direct stimulus into the economy, rather than paying a bunch of people to sit in offices every day approving or denying claims. And wouldn't that be a dream come true? Imagine never sending another cent to the IRS in your life ever again, and never even having to look at another utility bill again. Whew! I think everyone would benefit from this, and it's possible to implement if we come together, if we stay focused and stay engaged. Let's reach out, let's find our allies, and really make this happen. And remember that the LADWP is already publicly owned. That's right, we own it. It's ours. We can take control of all of the resources our state produces and the apparatus which governs it. So the future of reality really is in the palm of your hand. Whoa, power trip. I've personally come to see this as a national security issue. You know, I live just a stone's throw from the Porter Ranch Aliso Canyon storage facility. Remember where the gas leak happened? Insane. And when I saw some of my neighbors and their children with blood coming out of their noses just from breathing the air in our neighborhood, I couldn't believe it. And the fact that it was happening the same time as the Flint, Michigan water crisis, really burns my bubble. How could we let this happen? We live in one of the most innovative and inventive places on Earth, and yet we can't even drink the water or breathe the air? How fucked up is that? In the past decade, 28 people have died right here in the San Fernando Valley, colliding with freight trains and big rigs that were transporting oil. Now, has anyone ever heard of people dying because of solar power or wave power or wind power? It's preposterous. There was another crash, September of 2015, I believe. It was a train carrying fossil fuels, and it went off track. And I don't believe anyone died that time, thank goodness. But there were devastating fires and destruction nonetheless. And what the fuck for? So a disgusting, obsolete industry can milk what's left of its pathetic, dying little cash cow? Come on. Not allowed. Not anymore. The bastards have done this again and again and again. And to make matters even worse, fracking companies are injecting hazardous materials into our land, often seeping into our groundwater. And some farms are even watering our food crops with the leftover chemical waste. We can't let the goons get away with this any longer. If you are not working in the interests of the American people, you are no longer allowed to conduct business here, even if it means California withdrawing from the Union. That's right. Consider this Resistance Central and your Cal Exit headquarters. You think we fuck around? And of course, we can't talk about this without mentioning Standing Rock. Hey, newsflash, Standing Rock is not only an Indian reservation, it's a sovereign nation. And it has been since 1868. National sovereignty is another conservative cause, because foreign governments are not supposed to invade sovereign nations, especially not for a fucking oil pipeline. So I'm calling on humanitarians and constitutionalists alike to stand with Standing Rock and put the governor of North Dakota on trial for war crimes. There's a Sioux prophecy that's come to my attention about a giant black snake, which, if allowed to pass through, will kill us all. I believe this giant black snake is the oil pipeline. And no matter how state-of-the-art the infrastructure is, at least 3% of that black toxic sludge is guaranteed to leak. It's disgusting, and it will destroy us. Besides, there hasn't even been an environmental impact review. So there's no telling how devastating the completion of this pipeline will really be. I urge everyone to call their state representatives and tell them they fucked up. No one invades sovereign nations, tortures peaceful protesters, contaminates our environment, and gets away with it. This utter disregard for human and earthly life is not only unacceptable, it's unnecessary. There is a better way. In fact, 4 cities have already managed to convert their utility grids to a 100% renewable and sustainable system. They're Greensburg, Kansas, Burlington, Vermont, Aspen, Colorado, and Georgetown, Texas. Then there's places like Israel that are on the cutting edge of aquaponics, hydroponics, and all kinds of other greenhouse technologies. I say we reach out to them as sister cities or sister states and take on as many of their ideas as possible. Get them on the phone. I mean, if ancient Persians could store ice cubes underground for entire summers, and Romans developed a way to use their aqueduct system as air conditioning, I think we could pull off a clean energy system in California nowadays. It's been said that the Earth is its own generator. And if the macrocosm and microcosm are symbiotic, if the principle of as above, so below still applies, then every household can be its own generator too. Ultimately, if we can't have drinkable water and breathable air, then we can't function as a community. That makes the need for clean energy a case of national security. And it's not too much to ask. Let's take this seriously and let's take action now. Thank you. That's enough of my rant. Oh, but I forgot about Germany. Wait a minute. Even Germany, the cloudiest country in all of Europe, is producing so much solar energy right now that their entire electrical grid was being overloaded and they had to upgrade the whole thing. And yet LA, with so many opportunities for wind power, wave power, and solar power right at our fingertips, especially here in the valley where it's flat and we have thousands of abandoned parking lots, we're acting like it's still the 1800s. So do you think maybe we could get just a little piece of that $6.5 trillion that went missing from the Pentagon last year? Can you believe that shit? It's like, oops, we lost $6.5 trillion tax dollars. Don't know what happened to it. Well, sorry about that. Oh well, moving on. No, 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 no. You think you're bad? We're the bad motherfuckers right now. And just like when California sued the EPA back in 2007 for not letting us set our own emission standards, we'll have to take matters into our own hands. Here in the Golden State, we have one of the largest economies on planet Earth. The most creative, forward-thinking minds are right here. And yet, we're bearing so much of the burden for the taker states that pay nothing in taxes compared to us. In fact, when California's taxes are paying for people like Georgia to still have segregated proms, it certainly qualifies as taxation without representation. I didn't sign up for that shit. Now, I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but for example, California pays the federal government in taxes something like, well, for every dollar we send to the federal government, they give us back like a quarter. Whereas a state like Georgia, one of the taker states, for every dollar they send to the federal government, they get back like $2 or $3. So you see that we already have a very collectivist structure in this country, but now we need to just straighten out our priorities. And if those bastards want segregation in their state, I sure as hell ain't paying for it. We have some of the highest housing costs, the highest taxes, the highest gas prices, and we're devastating our home to grow food and to bring in oil and provide for people that still want to hang the Confederate flag. And I've had it. And I've had it with supporting an abusive, corrupt, and unchecked federal government. Enough is enough. And remember, Thomas Jefferson said that when our government becomes destructive, it is our duty to abolish it and create a new one. That time has come, my friends. California alone has a larger population than all of Canada. And I'm open to different strategies. Washington and Oregon are pretty cool. If they want to decide that they want to be a part of our new union, that'd be great. Alaska and Hawaii are pretty cool too. They're invited. And maybe we'll stay under the U.S. military for now, but just separate economically, you know? Statehood is more symbolic than anything else. So what state of mind are you in? Think about it. What if we had let the South secede when they wanted to? Imagine the kind of progress we would have made in the North by now, not being beholden to backwards ideologues and disproportionate numbers of senators. This is taxation without representation, and we're not going to take it anymore. The United States was never meant to be this big. It was supposed to be just 13 tiny colonies, and Great Britain warned us not to fuck with the Aboriginal Americans and not to overextend ourselves. But we're like, boo-boo, we're going in. And the imperialism still hasn't stopped. It's become completely unsustainable. You remember when the Katrina hurricane happened and trucks filled with medical supplies were sent down to New Orleans from New York and D.C.? Well, you know what happened when the trucks arrived? They were told to go right back where they came from. Oops, sorry, we don't need you after all. Go home. Misunderstanding. And it's like, what a waste. Too much centralization leads to serious abuse, waste, and excess like this in many, many, many ways. So maybe we should break the country up into a bunch of smaller unions. The 9 nations of the United States. Think about it. Hey, could be fun. I've actually had a map drawn up since 2007, and I will be circulating it online soon. By the way, if you haven't already, follow me on Twitter and Facebook. Just search for Colin Kramer or the Populist podcast. We're there. And maybe the first step is creating a new political party. I'd like to call it the Commonwealth Party. Or the Populist Party, or the Unity Party. Call it whatever the fuck you want, but start showing up. Show up to meetings, and it doesn't even have to be a separate party. It can be a movement within the Democratic Party, or even within the Libertarian Party. Hell, show up to a Republican Party meeting. I mean, that's an important American institution. Take it back from these goons, these insane people that have just destroyed us with partisan politics. Take us back to our roots. And if we take our government back, one municipality at a time, local movements have always had a more direct and a more long-lasting impact. More people participate when issues are local, and it tends to be nonpartisan at the local level. Decentralization is the key to keeping corporate abuses in check, ending partisan gridlock, and eventually flipping the power pyramid upside down. So, we need to take a quick break, and when we come back, you're in for a real treat. Our first guest, Steve Phillips, is going to talk us through a self-defense surveillance workshop, speaking of abuse of power. And he's going to reveal some very effective ways of protecting yourself from corporations, governments, and hackers. So stay tuned.
You're listening to The Populist Papers, a podcast for the people.
Steve Phillips is the founder of CryptTag, an organization dedicated to protecting the privacy of every internet user by building secure apps for activists, journalists, and you. He is the creator of executable philosophy, a new philosophical methodology that enables us to compute philosophical facts and more. He helps organize Revolution LA, a progressive grassroots organizing group in LA whose objective is to create a peaceful, people-powered revolution, setting the framework for a society that benefits the many and not the few. He also organizes a new San Francisco Bay Area-based group called Cypherpunks Write Code, whose mission is to galvanize the world's developer and designer communities to contribute to free, open-source, privacy-enhancing software that the world so desperately needs. Steve, thank you for being with us. Welcome to the Populist Papers.
Thanks, Colin. Excited to be here. This is great.
Now, I was talking earlier in my rant about the Jeffersonian tradition in America. He's one of my favorite presidents. He might be my favorite intellectual of all time. I mean, he's just so
cool.
Quotable. He and Oscar Wilde, I could just read their quotes all day. And, looking into it, I've got actually a letter handy, and Jefferson is describing his take on patents. And in many ways, he was kind of the godfather of the open source movement. Can you break down for us some of the history behind the open source movement?
Sure. I mean, I don't know it as far back as Jefferson, that's for sure. But in sort of modern times, the open source movement. So first of all, so what does it mean for a piece of software to be open source? If software is open source, that means that the source code, that's the sort of instructions that a computer programmer types in order to program a computer. That source code is open for anyone in the world to see if it's an open source program. Now, the open source movement it's sort of a subset. It's very much related to and comes out of a sort of broader and more politically minded movement called the free software movement. That was started by Richard Stallman in, I think, 1985 or so. And he says that originally all software was open source. He was at MIT, and people were, writing cool programs and learning from each other. And he said it's this very intellectually rich environment. And that kind of learning, that sort of control that you have over your own, over the things that affect your life, such as, and if you're on a computer a lot, then, obviously the computer is very important. And he knew that in the future that a lot of people would be using computers, and he didn't like this idea that some company could write proprietary software, closed source software, where it's doing who knows what. You have no idea. Maybe there's malicious features in there that you don't know about, and yet in order to kind of live your life and do what you need to do on a computer, you're going to have to kind of put up with this software that may include malicious features. And he thinks that if it's your computer, it should be doing what you want it to do, not what other people want it to do, not what the software developers want it to do, or some company that is not beholden to you. So originally, he's like I said, originally at MIT, everything was open source, and then he said all these private companies started up, and they were doing like artificial intelligence, and they all wanted their kind of secret sauce and their best way of doing AI. So he said the sort of intellectual environment at MIT, at least in their AI lab, was sort of ruined, and then there's all these people went off and sort of fractured among all these closed source AI companies. So he's sitting there and he's like, well, like this sucks. Like my sort of friends and environment have sort of gone to these private companies, and they're writing proprietary software. So he said, okay, there's lots of like proprietary closed source stuff that exists, but I'm going to start the free software movement, where it's not just that all the software is open source, but there's also other freedoms attached to that other than just the open source part, and that is whoever has access to free software cannot just see the source code, but they should be able to modify that source code. They should be able to run those programs on their own computer that have those modifications that they've added, and they should be able to redistribute those pieces of software that have those changes. So he thought that just gave more people kind of more control over their lives. And when you use the term open source to Richard Stallman, he's sort of disgusted and said, it's not just about being able to see the source code; it's about being able to kind of control what is on your computer and be able to have these other freedoms. So, so as far as open source goes, which again is kind of a subset, it's kind of like just part of the free software idea. I mean, open source has, taken over the world in some ways. I mean, if you look at the software that is used to, say, serve up web pages, almost all of that software is open source, except a little bit that Microsoft has created. Android, which runs on over 1 billion devices, which is obviously Google's open source operating system, the core of that is open source, although Google has made more and more of it proprietary over time, which is unfortunate. And Richard Stallman would tell you that, look, if you only have open source, then at any time, a private company could come along and say, you know what, the next version of our software isn't going to be open source. And then you're kind of locked in some ways, analogous to how we are with Android. Because Android is open source and it's not, there's not these additional free software freedoms that guarantee that that you can kind of make these modifications and that future versions won't be made closed source. Anyway, that's a problem for kind of software freedom.
Right. I definitely like this idea that the more of a rich public domain we have, the freer the world will be, and just keeping accessibility as open as possible. And Jefferson does talk about that in his letter about how inventions and ideas, they're of nature. Men are of nature. And, we are kind of meant to share these things for the common good of all. And it's meant to spread like wildfire. So as you said, not just access, but the ability, the freedom, to modify. And, it's all an ongoing experiment. That's the whole beauty of it. And the fact that we have this apparatus. The federal government was able to, best country in the world, we figured out internet. And somehow, just like with pharmaceuticals, we collectively invest in all this stuff because our government can take risks that the private sector never could. So the fact that we're all invested in this, these technologies and these discoveries, and yet we just end up turning them over. It's like we're socializing all the liabilities and investment, and then somehow we're allowing the benefits to be privatized by a very small few. Yeah, it's kind of like the saying, a rising tide raises all boats. I can definitely relate to, as an educator, figuring out lesson plans. A lot of teachers try and reinvent the wheel. And it's so great to have things like Scratch, which is MIT. But again, it benefits everyone when these things are accessible and open. So let's get into the hacker movement a little bit. I'd love to hear your take on sort of when it began and how that overlaps in some ways with the open source community.
Sure. So the term hacker is sort of tricky just because there's so many different definitions. So yes, there's a hacker in the sort of software security, computer security sense. People are hacking into some other device, hacking into some computer. But I believe the original sort of notion of hacker actually also comes out of MIT. They had a what were they called?
Oh, was it the phone freaks?
There's some of that, but before that, there was like a railroad club. I forget what it was called. I should have looked this up. But anyway, at MIT, there's this original notion of people doing kind of hardware hacks. So people were doing interesting things with with hardware, but yeah, that seemed to quickly kind of merge with some of the software stuff. You mentioned phone phreaking, where people were figuring out that instead of having to put coins into like a public phone or a what are they even called? Not a toll phone, payphone, a
Right.
payphone.
Yeah.
Wow.
Haven't used one of those in a while.
I know it's only 15 years, but I guess that's
Well, I'm scared
that's a
of
while.
them. Whenever I see them, like they look scary. Like I'm gonna get some disease or something from touching it. Like,
No, it's true. Yeah, my parents were worried. They're like, hey, if you put your finger in to like grab coins out, somebody might have put like a needle in there to like give you. I'm like probably, I don't know. It's one of those like fear-based news stories that is totally classic, where it's like it's probably zero people who've ever been affected by that, or maybe one, but it turns into some giant thing, which speaks to how the media makes money off of headlines and fear and stuff like that. But
corporate sensationalism. Yeah, the media. Whenever people try and tell me the media is liberally biased, I tell them they're sensationally biased.
Right. Yeah, there's different biases from different, stations, which stem from different power factions and stuff like that. But anyway, back to payphones, I guess.
Yeah, phone phreaking.
Yeah. With phone phreaking, there's people who realize, like, wait a second, instead of putting coins into, instead of having to pay for like long distance calls, what's really going on is that like when you press a number on a payphone, what's really going on is that transmits a certain sound, and if you get like a certain device that is capable of making sounds at specific frequencies, you can just make those sounds, each of which represents a distinct number, and you kind of point that toward the receiver of the phone, and instead of having to pay for those calls, they realized that you could make calls for free. And then so it started off as these sort of geeks who were playing with telecommunications network like suddenly existed around that time. They thought that was interesting, and they realized they could do prank calls. There's one where I think Steve Wozniak did the following. Steve Wozniak co-founded Apple. He said he played this prank where he had, and they like figured out not just to make free calls, but to like figure out how to sort of do what they wanted with the phone network. So one time, I think it was Woz, he often goes by Steve Wozniak, he played this prank where he had two other people's phones ring at the same time, and when they picked up, they were on a call with each other. They're like, hello, hey, you just called me. No, you just called me. No, you definitely just called me. And of course he's listening and like cracking up at how awesome it was to do stuff like that. So you can see the sort of attitude where it's not about, this criminal behavior and trying to, destroy things or anything. I mean, Richard Stallman, who I mentioned earlier, creator of the free software movement, he defines hacking as playful cleverness. So if you're hacking on software, hacking on hardware, either way, you're like trying to figure out new techniques. You're just cleverly sort of experimenting with technology. So that's the notion of hacking. Like when people say, talk about hackerspaces. I co-founded Santa Barbara Hackerspace in 2010, and I wanted an environment where I could hack on software and learn from other people and experiment with technology and just learn a lot of stuff that way. So there's that notion of hacking.
Right, and that real quick kind of piggybacks with what we're talking about with open source, because my understanding was that initially the hacking movement was about making every personal computer as rich and as accessible as a public library or, a research institution, just to have as much information at everyone's fingertips as possible.
Yeah, I mean, one of the original goals of Microsoft was like a computer on every desk, which, at the time, it's like people thought of a computer as a thing that took up a whole room. It was like millions of dollars, and only in the, I think it was 70s and like early 80s, I believe, where it started to be possible to like create, I think they're called microcomputers, where you get something closer to a desktop. So yes, it was possible to suddenly do those things. But I believe like the early people working on computing, such as Microsoft, like they wanted people to be able to do desktop publishing, as it was called at the time. Like, wow, people could like create, they could write books or create flyers or do these things that you think of like a big publisher only being able to do. Only they have those resources, but being able to do that in your home is something that's empowering for individuals and businesses to do. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting backstory there as far as the early parts of computing and how Apple got started, how Microsoft got started. I believe that Steve Jobs was like seeing these geeks playing these pranks and with the phone calls and whatnot, and he was like, "Come on, guys!" And then he apparently Steve Jobs convinced him to build, I think it was called a blue box, with this little device that would allow you to make free international calls. So Steve Jobs was trying to monetize this stuff, and other people were like, "Isn't it so cool that we figured out how to do this?" So yeah, pretty different attitudes, but yeah, Steve Jobs started to sort of monetize things that way, and then Apple Computer was started shortly thereafter when he realized that Steve Wozniak was so talented at like doing software and hardware stuff.
Now, you and I met at an anti-spying coalition meeting.
Mm-hmm.
When did you start attending meetings like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So yes, we were at the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition meeting. I believe it was.
Yes.
So so I'm working on like writing encryption software to protect people's privacy. So for a while, I've gone around and figure I should talk to as many potential users as possible and kind of figure out what kind of information that do people hold kind of most private that they want to protect. Is it there's data sitting in Dropbox that's like unencrypted. There's stuff in Google Drive. There's emails. There's text messages. There's phone calls. In some cases, there are good ways to protect that information that already exists, and they're open source and usually also free software. And we can talk about what some of those are. But yeah, if I think of my own history and thinking about privacy and surveillance and whatnot, I guess we'd probably have to go back to around the time I was in college and just learning a lot through college for sure. And I was a pretty studious person, but I really feel like I learned more through the internet even during college than I did like through my classes.
Right.
And I just became so aware of all these problems that are going on in the world, all these injustices, and I remember there's a time where I just watched a bunch of these like interviews with that were just up on YouTube, interviews with homeless people and like all the challenges they faced and just how unfair a lot of that seemed to be, and like that was really saddening. And then a pretty important moment for me was around I think it was the summer of 2007, and there was this sort of uprising in Iran, and people are using Twitter and social media to communicate, and in like pretty gory detail, like in my Twitter feed, it's like, okay, here's people in Iran who were literally being killed, and there's this one woman in particular, I think her name was Nadia, something like that, pretty young, and you just see her like get shot, and she like stops moving, and it's like, it's really horrifying to see, and I just felt like, man, now more than ever, I'm like intimately familiar with these horrible things in the world, and what am I going to do? Like retweet some video? It just felt so powerless seeing these problems, and it's like, okay, they're thousands of miles away. I would love to be able to solve homelessness, but I felt like I didn't have a great angle of attack. So anyway, I just it seemed like there were these mounting injustices in the world that I was becoming more and more aware of, and yet there wasn't one that I could kind of immediately go after. So like that's happening, and then, but through all this time, I'm a computer geek. I started programming a couple years after that. I took a few programming classes in college, but mostly did math and philosophy. But anyway, if we fast forward from that time, like I said, around 2007 to around 2012, I had co-founded Santa Barbara Hackerspace. I'm doing programming. I'm doing some entrepreneurial stuff, tech startup stuff, side projects, programming, and then suddenly around, I think it was 2012, I just started learning about more about surveillance, online surveillance. It was rumored at the time that Facebook had made it possible for the U.S. government to just kind of grab whatever information Facebook had on all U.S. citizens that were Facebook members, and just kind of, do whatever they wanted, have the government do whatever they wanted with that information. I was thinking about, okay, how could that be abused? And then there's actually a show that Julian Assange created. At some point, it was called the Julian Assange Show. It had a couple other names, but eventually RT, which originally stood for Russia Today. Anyway, they bought the rights to that video. They were broadcasting it online, and I was able to see this episode called Cypherpunks, and I was aware of what a cypherpunk was. A cypherpunk is somebody who believes that that we should use encryption to protect human rights, especially privacy and freedom of speech. And we can talk about how encryption could possibly enable freedom of speech a little bit later with a piece of software that lets you anonymously browse the web. But anyway, in this episode, there's just such a compelling case laid out by Julian Assange and another guy named Jacob Appelbaum, and they just made it super clear that, look, the whole world's information flows over the internet. We have militaries and spy agencies that are sort of infiltrating this thing. Humanity talks to itself. Activists organize. All these things happen over the internet. People have cell phones now. People can be physically tracked in real time. And in one of my talks that I gave a few years later, just earlier this year, I ran that as a thought experiment to people, and I said, imagine if Hitler had known the real-time physical location of every Jew.
Wow.
And it's oh my God, this, we're setting ourselves up here. You realize how much worse the Holocaust or something like that would have been if you had today's surveillance regime in place.
Right. I can't imagine. And not just being able to track every Jew, but being able to know who are the Christian sympathizers, before they even do anything to help Jews escape. They already know, well, these people must be sympathizers with the cause because they're reading these books or they're tweeting this thing.
Yeah, it's so true. So protecting that information, they can, and thanks to, and actually in that very episode of Julian Assange's show, Jacob Appelbaum mentioned that Facebook is the world's largest database of Jews, and Muslims and Christians and everyone else, right? So it's if you have this kind of centralized power, this kind of centralized information on all of humanity, we're just begging for abuses here. And at that time, we didn't know about some of those. It would be about a year later when the full breadth of the surveillance state and what the National Security Agency's capabilities are, thanks to Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, who reported on those leaks. But it started to become clear that, okay, this is a really, really important problem. And the solution is to write encryption software write privacy-enhancing software that leverages encryption and protects people's communications, protects their data, so that using the internet isn't this huge hazard to everyone's freedoms. So the joke within the cypherpunk community is that a cell phone is a tracking device that makes phone calls, where if you think about it, it's definitely tracking physical location. Maybe you're making phone calls, maybe you're not. That's sort of secondary. It's definitely tracking. That part is guaranteed if it's on in the first place. So anyway, but like I said, I sort of become aware of there's all these problems in the world, and I don't seem like I have a good way to solve them. And then it's wait a second. I'm now a programmer. The two main programming languages that I was programming in at the time and still use are two of the best ones for writing encryption software in the first place. Like, the internet exists, so I can like distribute the software for free over the internet and like protect people's rights. At that point, it's like I have no excuse, I have no reason to not just like to pursue this aggressively. This is a place where I can make a huge impact potentially by protecting people's privacy with open source software. Privacy has also been enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So like this issue should have been settled, and in some ways was hundreds of years ago. And, like one of the whole points of creating the United States in the first place was to have things like the Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment. And it's really sad to see even aspects, like major aspects of the U.S. government under Obama, and I'd be surprised if things were better under President Trump. I don't think I'll ever get used to using that phrase. But it's hard to imagine things to be like less authoritarian under Trump, probably. But anyway, that issue aside, it's a scary precedent to see the government say, we need a backdoor. We need to be able to get into everyone's stuff, and they just don't realize that. They don't realize what other parts of what other aspects of the intelligence community realize, and that is that the U.S. has more to lose than any other country in the world by making software purposely vulnerable. Like, what a dumb idea. So that battle is happening internally in like NSA and FBI and whatnot. But people who violate someone's privacy, like only if they have a warrant, only if it's legal for them to do so. So anyway, that's
well,
as you can tell,
I remember one of the most interesting debates during the Republican primaries when, it was still a full cast of goons up on that stage. And it got really good when Rand Paul and Chris Christie were going at it because, of course, you remember that part. Christie was saying, we need to do some kind of mass surveillance just so we know who to get those warrants for. And, it became this sort of catch-22 because Rand Paul was saying, no, you can't do any kind of surveillance like that unless you've already gone to a judge and gotten the warrant. And then it was just like this back and forth. Oh, well, how do we get the warrant unless we show them the evidence, which we would need to obtain from some kind of surveillance? So, I mean, how do you reconcile a debate like that?
Right. It's a good question. But, I mean, if the universe had just been created right now and we didn't know anything about history and we hadn't, like, mapped out terrorist networks and, like, looked at the phone books and the phone records of people who have been caught doing crimes and, okay, who are they communicating with? Like, a lot of that has been figured out. So people pretend that, like, the government needs to be able to fish around in a billion people's private communications in order to do their job, which, again, the Fourth Amendment was created to make it clear that it should be illegal for there to be anything like a general warrant. You need to specify, here's the particular person, here's why they're suspected, here's the things that can be seized, and whatnot. So another thing that's really, really, really important here is to understand that mass surveillance has never prevented a terrorist attack of any type.
Wow.
So they say that it's critical for the NSA to be able to gather everything in order to keep you safe. One of the most important points that Snowden has made, and that I think has been underappreciated, is that because the NSA is gathering everything, that is in fact distracting them, horribly distracting them from paying attention to the extremely few actual legitimate threats. So, for example, I mean, there's several examples here, okay? So 9/11 could have literally been prevented without having to do any more surveillance than the NSA was doing at the time. And there was, like if you remember, there was this infighting right after 9/11 because it's like the NSA and the FBI and Homeland Security were all pointing the finger at each other saying, well, they didn't give us the information that we needed. And part of that was true. Like each of them had a little bit of information such that if they would have pieced it together, they would have realized that there was an attack planned on the Twin Towers. But they They didn't connect the dots. And that was their directive that they were given after 9/11. And I totally support that. But what does connect the dots mean? It means take the information that you already have and you piece it together to understand what you're looking at. So, but instead what the NSA did is expand surveillance capabilities and just collect more and more information. So you're searching for a needle in the haystack, looking for some possible terrorist attack, just piling and piling on more and more hay from just random, like people who are not suspected of anything on the internet, that's overwhelming the NSA with information. So they can't find the needle that's actually there. A second example, the Boston bombers. Russian intelligence told our intelligence agencies, look, there's these two brothers. One of them is associated with some other terrorists. I think that they were in Russia. They told us, keep an eye on these guys. And we did a little bit. There's like an FBI file or Homeland Security file of these brothers. Okay, here's their background. Here's why we should keep an eye on them. But for whatever reason, they totally screwed that up. They didn't keep an eye on somebody who foreign intelligence told us was a potential terrorist. And instead, they're trying to deal with like hundreds of millions or billions of people's communications, which is just totally insane trying to sift through that. You're going to have like millions of false positives where people, use some phrase, sound suspicious, in a text message and just try to look into that. I mean, there's not going to be anything there almost 100% of the time. So, so understanding that history is really important because it's just a total false dichotomy, fascinatingly, counterintuitively, but fascinatingly, to say that there's this trade-off between privacy and security, right? Like it's literally true that when you have less privacy, there's just a barrage of information that is distracting the NSA from actual threats. So we can have more privacy and more security. Now we need to reel in the NSA. Like one of the worst perverse incentives that I know of that exists is the fact that the worse a job the NSA does, the more they will be showered with money, right? As soon as there's some attack, it's like, oh man, we need to give our intelligence agencies everything that they need. And that sounds reasonable, but like they just end up doing more mass surveillance. And I'm really worried that the incentives are not in place where the NSA feels like, you know what, we really need to prevent these attacks. Although if we don't, we'll just get billions and billions of more dollars. And then there's all this money that goes back and forth between NSA and its contractors. Anyway, like when you think of a big government run amok, people should be thinking about the NSA. When you think of kind of a perversion of centralized power within the federal government, you should think, oh, there's these like contracts for like ridiculously high amounts of money that are just totally wasteful that are going to these contractors. Not that different from when like Dick Cheney was giving no bid contracts to Halliburton and other companies. So there's just this systemic corruption at several steps, and it's really unfortunate, especially because there's an NSA whistleblower named Bill Binney. Sometimes he goes by William Binney, and he worked at the NSA for 30 or 40 years. He was a code breaker. He helped actually create some of NSA's spying capabilities in order to spy on Russia. And at a major hacker conference, Bill Binney spoke and he apologized to the audience, saying, I didn't mean for the things that I created to be turned around and used against you. And that's what happened. So there's these good-meaning people. They're trying to help the U.S. They're trying to find foreign threats. And the NSA goes, wait a second, why don't we use this domestically in order to find domestic terrorists and whatnot? And of course, that's going to be used by Trump or whoever to find Muslims or black people or Mexicans or whoever's going to be targeted. Even if it's not by Trump, any future president is going to have this enormous surveillance state just waiting to be abused. And people are I think in the U.S., we're too comfortable with the idea that, the U.S. is just so special that any sort of horrible, Holocaust-like event is somehow impossible or, extremely unlikely. even with all the centralized power and all these people vying for these levers of power in order to control them. But anyway, I mentioned William Binney because he created some of these kind of spying capabilities. And one program that he created is called ThinThread. And what does ThinThread do? It does something very important. Bill Binney says that he looked that ThinThread would automatically look for like potentially suspicious activity, and it would flag it for humans to look at. And he said that it did a very efficient job of doing this processing. And he also says that when it would like find like personal information on somebody that like could be suspicious, that it would encrypt that information and then force that person at the NSA to get a warrant in order to look at some person's information, because that would make it legal. And and William Binney wanted to do things legally. He said his bosses at the NSA were not interested in doing things legally, that they would rather just like not jump through these extra hoops, not ask for this special permission in order to do this mass spying. They'd rather just do it. They thought they could get away with that.
We're going to cut through all the red tape.
Right. Yeah. Let's just do whatever we want as like a secret government agency with billions and billions of dollars, and not really respect the intent of the Fourth Amendment. Another detail there that Snowden mentioned, which again I think this is a point that he made. This is particularly underreported. He mentioned this at some like parliament meeting or some government meeting in Germany, where he remotely kind of teleconferenced in. Edward Snowden says that the NSA employs 120 lawyers to go through the legislation that governs what the NSA can legally do, and they literally redefine the words in those laws so the NSA can do whatever the fuck it wants.
Unbelievable.
Isn't that just the greatest perversion of the law? Like, of course what you do is legal if you redefine what the words of the law mean. It's just, anyway, it's pretty disgusting. It would be intellectually interesting if there were this actual weighing between privacy and security, because like if you just think of how the debate's normally framed, like that's a hard question, but that's not reality. We don't have to give up civil liberties, and I'm really happy that that's the case. You would think that if you were collecting everyone's information, that eventually you'd like have something useful that you couldn't have figured out through just traditional police type investigative work.
Good old-fashioned police work.
Yeah, like that's what that kind of thing and FBI type stuff is what has led to gathering information that can be used to like prevent attacks, but mass surveillance hasn't done us any good. It's been really expensive and destroying civil liberties. So whatever we can do to like lobby against and put pressure on our legislators to do whatever they can to reel in the NSA, let's get some more more oversight in there. There's programs that are extremely wasteful and just don't do any good. Snowden says that in the office, the NSA people would be like trading like nude photos of hot girls that they would find through this like mass surveillance. It's like they're not focused on Paris for the most part. I mean, there's only like a couple 100,000 terrorists in the world, and there's like 3 billion people online. So yeah, they're just distracted, and that makes us less safe, not more safe.
Well, that reminds me of when some of those SEC agents that basically knew the great crash of 2008 was on its way, and instead they were like filling up boxes and boxes filled with porn.
Oh yeah,
and, these people are making like 6-figure salaries, and
wow.
Out of control. Now it's funny. A lot of times when I frame this argument to people, they're kind of like, "Oh well, I don't really care. I assume my apartment is bugged or whatever." I think we've all had like weird moments. I actually used to work at a private investigation agency, and I had just seen the film The Lives of Others, which is all about the East Germany in the 80s, at sort of the height of their surveillance apparatus.
Oh wow.
Right. The Deutschland Democratic Republic, DDR, I guess was the official term. And it's really an amazing movie. It's one of my all-time favorites. And just enough strange things were happening. I basically was convinced that I I was under surveillance, but I didn't think it was from any kind of federal agent in my case.
Mm,
I thought it was just my boss spying on me. I mean, it's like this
interesting.
rich multimillionaire, kind of obsessive personality tendencies. And I think my bigger concern, we're talking about out of control government and federal waste and whatnot, but beyond that, because this is what I hear from a lot of people, they say, well, I have nothing to worry about. They seem really not to feel affected or bothered by it because, they know they're not a terrorist. They're not doing anything too insane, and it's not really going to affect their lives. So, they figure that it's worth it. And I'm like, well, I mean, forget about the government. We can find ways to defund branches of the government, hold
Mhm.
people accountable and whatnot. I don't see the government as such a distant and nefarious thing as a lot of people do. But what I am concerned about, and I'm definitely not alone in this, is crony capitalism, predatory capitalism, and how a lot of these big businesses, these multinational corporations, how they can use surveillance as an unfair advantage over
Yeah.
more local businesses, and it definitely seems like it just opens up this kind of access to our behaviors. It's spooky. Sometimes I'll mention something like, "Oh yeah, I'm thinking about getting a GoPro." I'll say that in a casual conversation, and then I'll feel my phone vibrate a second or two later, and it'll be like an
Hmm.
email from eBay saying, "Oh, we sell GoPros now. Check out some of these deals." And I'm just like, "What? Was that like a reverse microphone?" Or,
Huh.
I mean, the
Yeah.
world is already just such a serendipitous place, and I love coincidences. And I do
Not all
believe,
coincidences.
I right. Well, I do believe in magic, and I feel like this weird kind of mechanized, mass surveilled state we're in, it takes away so much of that. There already is such serendipity, and when things like this happen, it's just dirty. It feels
Yeah.
very, very contrived. So yeah, I mean, what do you think? Are we in more danger of being spied on from our own government, or from corporations, or from sort of the overlap, the crony capitalism between the two?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it depends on the individual, right? There's different people who will be deemed suspicious by different groups. So, I mean, one thing I would say is luckily the same pieces of software will protect your privacy, whether regardless of who's like monitoring your internet connection, right? Or your phone or something. So, like if your messages are encrypted, they're encrypted, and whoever's trying to look at them, other than the intended recipient, will not be able to read them unless they, it's possible to like hack into someone's phone or to, um, do perform certain attacks. But when it comes to either mass surveillance by the government or more localized surveillance by private companies or private investigators or people that are even more local than that, there's teenagers with like really invasive parents that won't let them, send a message to anybody without trying to look at it and kind of, invade people's privacy that way. And so that's something that I had to try to become more cognizant of, is kind of like you're saying, where, okay, it's not just about this like mass surveillance stuff, this government surveillance. There's privacy violations that are a little bit closer to home, sometimes very, very literally. But yeah, I would have to say that it depends on the individual and like what information they're really trying to keep private and who they're at risk of being spied upon from. But again, it's generally the same technologies that will protect your privacy, whether it's the government or criminals or whoever who's trying to get your information. Maybe maybe they're trying to do some kind of identity theft. Maybe your mom doesn't trust your boyfriend or whatever. Like there's all these kinds of situations where people are trying to spy on you. But But yeah, I mean, now might be a good time to talk about what some of those pieces of software are to protect your privacy.
Definitely. Yeah, I was just going to ask specifically, about specific tricks and tips and techniques. So, how can people protect themselves?
Yeah, great question. So the first thing that I would recommend doing, especially if you have a smartphone or if you have a smartphone, I would download a program, install a program called Signal, Signal. It's open source software, so you know that there's no malicious features that have been added to it, which nicely ties into what we talked about earlier. So yeah, Signal. What does Signal do? Signal is a program that allows you to send encrypted text messages and have encrypted phone calls. Now, the person you're communicating with also needs to have Signal installed so that their phone knows how to decrypt the messages that you send them. But there's some really, really top-notch programmers who are working on Signal. There's a nonprofit called Open Whisper Systems. Anyway, they do really, really great work. Signal is the main program that they create. And Signal works on Android. It also works on iPhones. And they also recently released a program called Signal Desktop, which is really convenient. I use it every day, where if I get a text message, it doesn't just show up on my phone, it also shows up in the Signal Desktop app on my computer.
Oh, that's excellent.
Yeah. So there's be times where, I want to share some links or type up something that's longer, or just not be, staring at my phone or keep an eye on my phone. If I'm on my computer, I just get these little pop-up messages that show up, and yeah, I can use a full keyboard to check. So it's really great.
I definitely need to download that because oftentimes, I'm away from the phone, it's charging in the other room, or, I text message myself lots of notes and ideas and things to keep track of, and I don't really, if the phone dies on me, I don't want to lose all that. So that is a great backup tool as well.
Yeah, good point. So Signal, definitely number one. There's some privacy tools that aren't that easy to use, but Signal's very easy to use. So again, Android and iPhone. If you just search for Signal in your app store, then I would install that. The second piece of software I would recommend that allows you to browse the web anonymously is a piece of software called Tor, the Tor browser. So if you go to torproject.org, T-O-R, project, project.org, then you should see a big sort of a download or an install button. And that piece of software runs on desktop. So it works on Windows and Mac OS and Linux. So it's pretty cool because Tor, there's a network of volunteers sort of all around the world that run special server software and on computers that they have. So I run a couple Tor nodes, they're called. So what does that mean? So when you are using Tor on your desktop, then instead of your computer visiting some website directly, what the Tor network does, it takes your request to try to visit some website, and it routes it through 3 randomly chosen computers that are on the internet somewhere that are part of the Tor network that are running on these servers, and then only then, after it's gone through these 3 hops, does it visit the website. So what that does is a couple things. So anyone who's monitoring your internet connection, whoever that is, they can see that you're using Tor. They see that you're on the Tor network, but they can't tell which website you're visiting. And whoever controls that website, assuming you're not logged in or specifying, telling them your name or stuff like that, if you're just not logged into something or logged into some fake account not tied to your real identity, then when you visit that website through the Tor network, they can't tell who you are. And specifically, they also can't tell where you are. They can't tell that because they don't get your IP address, which is something that it's a piece of information that websites usually get when you visit them directly. So anyway, because you can determine somebody's physical location or approximate physical location from their IP address, Tor anonymizes your physical location from a website that you visit. So Tor's the second major piece. One really interesting use case of this benefit that you can get from anonymizing your location is the following. There's this interesting story of there's this woman who tragically was experiencing spousal abuse. She had an abusive husband, and she decided to sort of escape and with her child in order to get away from that. Now she still wanted to use Facebook, but if after she escaped and she went to like her new home, if she would have logged in from Facebook without using Tor, then Facebook would see her IP address. It would know where she's physically located. And another critical piece of information is that her husband was like close friends with some cops, and she knew that he'd be able to get a search warrant on her. No big deal. And with that search warrant, then those police officers could have legally gotten certain information about her from Facebook, including which IP addresses and therefore which locations she's logged in from. So it would be dangerous for her to use Facebook without using something like Tor, because that doesn't give away her location.
Amazing.
So that's So Tor uses all these encryption techniques so that again, when somebody's like looking at your internet connection, they just see this like encrypted information going back and forth. They don't know that you're like downloading some particular website or leaking information to WikiLeaks or doing any of the other things that are really interesting that people can do with Tor. So yes, the Tor, you go to torproject.org, the Tor browser bundle is what you're looking for. Right now, there's no good version of Tor that runs on iPhone that I'm aware of, but on Android, if you install Orfox, ORFOX, and what's it called? Orbot, ORBOT. If you install both of those and then you use Orfox, which basically is Firefox, but it's a version that just goes through Tor, then you can anonymously browse the web on your Android phone.
That's great.
Yeah, so both of those are excellent. There's a few other tools we could, a couple of the ones that we could talk about, but both of those I highly recommend. I use them every day. Edward Snowden recommends that you use them. They're very, very good, open source. They've been thoroughly audited from a security standpoint, so there's not even, so there doesn't seem to be any like accidental vulnerabilities where your privacy could be violated. So yeah, those are great. There's some other. If you want to do encrypted email, for example, like unfortunately that is harder to set up, and I can't just kind of mention one program that you just simply install and then you're good. But yeah, there's a couple other things that we can talk about there. And I mean, if you do a search online, it could be a Google search. Actually, if you use DuckDuckGo.com instead of Google.com for searches, that protects your privacy better.
Right, I've heard about them.
Yeah, they're good. I mean, it's it's another company, but it's a major part of their sort of privacy policy and just part of their brand to not do any tracking. And of course, if you do what I and some other people do, and you use DuckDuckGo through Tor, then they definitely can't do any sort of how can I say? I mean, compared to doing a Google search while you're logged in into your Gmail account, and like Google knows exactly who you are and what you're looking for. If you're not logged into, I don't even think it's possible to log into DuckDuckGo actually, but if you use DuckDuckGo over Tor, then not only is DuckDuckGo not doing the extra tracking that Google tries to do, but they really can't because they don't know who you are.
Right, so you're in safe hands. DuckDuckGo, not only do they have a great mission statement, but it's just good to have a alternative like that to Google. And I'll tell you,
yeah.
I knew that Google had finally reached the point of having way too much power over us once the word Google became a verb.
Yeah. No, it's a great search engine, like the great results and everything. But yeah, I mean, it's, if you think of what any future government will have access to, for example, I mean, you think of all the information that Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Apple and all these companies have on you combined, and the NSA is pooling that together to just see what everyone is doing on like every website. And then on the sort of more corporate side, you can visit many different websites and tell a little bit of private information to each one. But sometimes on like behind the scenes, those different companies are kind of selling all that data and then there's other companies that kind of pool that together. So, can you imagine if in kind of real life and in the physical world, you like told a different secret to like 5 different friends, and then behind the scenes they like all colluded and like they're trying to collect all this information and try to figure more and more out about you. Like that's what it's like, but it's not just a couple secrets here and there. It's like all, everything you've ever typed into, some website or any information that you've given. So yeah, if you add all that up together, it can be pretty invasive, whether it's Google or anyone else.
Yeah, you're leaving yourself completely and utterly vulnerable. I remember the concern used to be like, the public libraries, one of our few socialized institutions that's still left.
Yep.
And I remember hearing, you don't want to check out Catcher in the Rye from a public library because they do keep track of what books you're getting. And if you're going to read a book like that, you're better off like going to a used bookstore and paying cash because obviously there were so many assassination attempts that were associated with fans of that book. And now, I mean, compared to Amazon and being able, if they were to be sharing, every book that I was looking at, I could definitely see myself being on the wrong watch lists and databases just for the kinds of material we're reading.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And then when you think of, check your stuff out from the library. When you read a book on your Kindle, Amazon doesn't just know which book you have. They know like which words you've read because they keep track of which page you're on so that when you come back, they can take you back to that page. So it's like, what kind of psychological profiling, especially when you think of how sophisticated these algorithms are getting and all the other information that it's had about you. Like I'm really, I'm worried about what the future of privacy looks like there. One of the worst examples that is, I really find honestly is pretty depressing that I learned about recently is how sophisticated facial recognition is getting. And so it's like, like in the future, we're going to be like at some political rally and I'm going to be seeing, Trump speak and I'm going to be shaking my head at some of the stuff that he's saying with an angry look on my face. And there's going to be like cameras that are pointed at the audience, spotting people who are now, suspicious because they clearly disagree with what's being said. Therefore, they might, oppose the state. And doesn't that kind of sound like terrorism all of a sudden, just because you disagree with the with the statement that somebody's making? So it's like, man, I'm really worried about the kind of physical security side or this kind of overlap between physical and electronic surveillance.
Right?
Where it's like, because of the internet, and even people without Facebook accounts. There's people who are trying to just totally avoid it completely. But, if, you're going to eventually be in some group picture that someone puts on Facebook, and the face is going to be like, oh, we don't recognize that face. And then if you're visiting web pages that have kind of Facebook cookies and like buttons and stuff embedded in those pages, Facebook, like even before you have a Facebook account, Facebook is trying to track you. And then later, if you sign up for a Facebook account and they realize, oh, this is the same person who visited all these pages before, they piece that information together and have information about you even before you join Facebook.
Wow.
So it's like, man, it's like they just got you from so many different, right now we're talking about like electronic surveillance and mass surveillance and stuff, but in the future, especially if, there's Google Glass and everyone has like this wearable computer with a camera, on their face or on their body, like, your face is going to be on like hundreds of cameras every day. So it's like online and using things like Tor, that will be one of the only places, maybe the only place that people have, or inside your own bathroom or something. But mostly online, it's like where you're going to have privacy. And, it's really important from a sort of intellectual development standpoint.
Another really interesting aspect of this argument. It came from a church where I did a little bit of work, and I think you did too, with Revolution LA, the first Unitarian church in Koreatown.
Yep.
I've always had a lot of respect for the Unitarian Universalist movement, a lot of interesting figures that were involved with that church. They were suing, the first Unitarian church was suing the federal government, particularly the NSA, and they were the primary plaintiffs in this lawsuit. There were some other people that had signed on as plaintiffs, including the NRA. You know, they're probably just always suing the federal government whenever they can, regardless of the cause. But it was a really interesting complaint. The church claimed that the NSA's surveillance on their assembly, it violated their First Amendment right to assemble and, freedom of religion. Because if people feel like simply from going to church, they're going to be put on some kind of suspect list or some kind of watch list, then they're not going to feel safe and they're not going to, feel comfortable in going to their congregation. So we had talked a lot about the Fourth Amendment earlier, but this is a really interesting case in how it violates several aspects of the First Amendment as well. And for good reason, because there are a lot of very sort of pacifist traditions with people like the Unitarians and the Quakers as well. I think they went through some of this during the Red Scare in the 50s. So, I mean, could you speak to that concern?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I actually remember one of the talks that Glenn Greenwald gave. Glenn Greenwald, of course, being as I mentioned earlier, he wrote the Snowden story with lower Quakers, and he's been a fierce sort of advocate for civil rights and whatnot in the U.S. for for a while now. As he pointed out, as he started like saying good things about WikiLeaks and critiquing the U.S. government and like overreach of surveillance and whatnot, he said that his readers were saying, WikiLeaks does sound great, but if I start to support them, I'm afraid I'm going to be put on some sort of list because they're publishing this like classified information and they're exposing all this wrongdoing. They're exposing fraud, waste, and abuse. There's, of course, the so-called collateral murder video that Chelsea Manning leaked to WikiLeaks. And as Glenn Greenwald reported, when our government went back to the Iraqis and tried to negotiate to stay in Iraq longer, they said they didn't want us there. And one of the reasons is because of that video that was leaked to WikiLeaks. So Chelsea Manning and WikiLeaks literally helped stop the Iraq War.
Incredible.
So that's the power. And Chelsea Manning used Tor in order to give that information to WikiLeaks.
Really?
Yes, I believe so. WikiLeaks accepts basically everything over Tor that they receive. I would be shocked, especially if Chelsea Manning is a computer geek. I'd be shocked if she wasn't using Tor in order to do that. That's like the way that people can safely do things like that, even if they're under heavy surveillance. So, but anyway, I brought up the WikiLeaks thing, and Glenn Greenwald made that point several years before. It was even before Snowden, and lo and behold, it is true. It is literally true that the U.S. government has requested from Twitter my personal information from Twitter because I follow WikiLeaks on Twitter, and the government considers that to be a suspicious act.
Wow.
So when you have things like that, yes, it makes sense for people to think, well, wait a second, I don't really have freedom of association anymore, right? Because I could be targeted. Now, that's nothing too hardcore. I mean, Twitter doesn't have that much information about me and nor other WikiLeaks followers, since most stuff that's on Twitter is public and purposely public. But it's still pretty. It's unfortunate that they want to clamp down on those kinds of associations with their political enemies, which is basically what WikiLeaks is. So yeah, that's a very important point and underscores the fact that using technologies like Tor enables you to not just protect your right to privacy, but I guess sort of through your right to privacy, through your anonymity by using Tor, that you can create a fake Twitter account that you only use from Tor, right? And then you could, follow WikiLeaks or do other political things on there, and it would be extremely difficult for the government to know that you're the one who's doing that. They can see that, okay, there's someone logged in from Tor who's controlling some Twitter account, but yes, using these tools enables you to get back part of your freedom of association, not just privacy in a sort of narrowly construed way. And another part of the First Amendment, right to free speech, is also protected by Tor, and just right to free speech in general, even if you're not in the U.S. and not protected by the First Amendment. One interesting example of this is bloggers in Egypt and bloggers in other countries, where if they aren't anonymous and they're blogging abuses by their government, they can be tortured, they can be thrown in jail. So using anonymizing technologies like Tor, and Tor's like the best one that we have right now, people are able to have free speech, have privacy, have freedom of association.
Wow. I had no idea Tor had already kind of played a role in history. So was that the leak of the helicopter footage?
Yes, exactly. Yep, that's the Apache helicopter that was flying around. There was some report that, okay, there's some people with guns, somewhere in the area. The Apache helicopter looked around, saw some people on the ground. They didn't have guns, and just killed all of them. That include 2 Reuters journalists. And the only reason why we found out about this is, we saw that we got the footage because of Chelsea Manning, but the reason why there was a fuss and why it was talked about, it's only because it was U.S. or I forget if it was U.S. or U.K. citizens, the 2 Reuters journalists, photojournalists. They were holding cameras in their hands. It's only because there was, the Reuters and the families of those people were like, hey, where are these people? They just disappeared. So they wanted answers, and then thanks to Chelsea Manning, answers were provided. But anyway, the Chelsea Manning said that she leaked that video because these sorts of events were happening all the time. It was totally normal to just to kill a bunch of people down below. They weren't armed. So yeah, it's pretty. It's fairly gruesome to watch. But the thing that is most striking about the video, in my view, and lots of people's views, is just the attitude of our soldiers toward these human beings who were down there. And so they tried shooting a bunch of people. They were firing missiles and stuff. And somebody kind of ran off to the side, and there was somebody who was in a van, and they fired again, and they fired a missile into the van, and it went through the windshield, and they're just like, hell yeah, that was awesome. And wow. It's like they're playing this video game. And when Chelsea gave her official statement during her trial, where she was convicted to 35 years in prison for exposing, killing, or arguably murder by our military, that's how whistleblowers get treated. So people tell Snowden, "Oh, you should have gone through the official channels. We would have totally gotten justice by going through, the system, by telling them that you're onto the illegal stuff that they're doing." No, it's total BS. But during Chelsea's trial, she said that she was witnessing things like this on a regular basis, and I think the phrase she used was it's like soldiers are acting like they're just torturing ants or just killing ants with a magnifying glass, and they just do not have enough sort of empathy for these lives that they're just ending. So anyway, pretty horrible incident, but yes, Tor is the way that people are able to leak some stuff over the internet without being caught, even if they're under heavy surveillance. And like I said before, if you're using Tor, then the website you're visiting doesn't know your location, doesn't know stuff about you, unless you're, again, logging to some service, or you're telling them who you are. So that also protects WikiLeaks, because WikiLeaks can honestly say, we don't know who leaked this. So even if you hacked WikiLeaks servers or whatever to try to figure out who did the leaking, you wouldn't be able to figure it out because that information isn't stored. WikiLeaks doesn't know.
If you want to be one of the very first to hear about the release of a new privacy-enhancing app built by CryptTag, Steve's nonprofit, or if you want to be one of the first to try out and help shape an early version of the upcoming CryptTag apps, including a chat and file sharing app that's extremely difficult to block or censor, a secure wiki app to take notes, or collaboratively compose documents, or a task management app to coordinate and organize actions with your team, visit cryptag.org and sign up for updates.
Yeah, those are the major ones. If people want to contact me, my website is tryingtobeawesome.com. And if you go to tryingtobeawesome.com/contact, there's many ways to contact me. Many of those are encrypted. Several of those are anonymous. There's many ways to get in touch with me.
Excellent. Well, really loved having you on. I want to give a huge and heartfelt thank you to Steve Phillips, live from San Francisco, one of my favorite cities on earth, founder of CryptTag, organizer of Revolution LA, founder of Cypherpunks Cypherpunks Write Code, look like Unite Code, and self-described small government socialist. Steve.
Absolutely.
Thanks again for being on and for all the great work that you do.
Thanks, Colin. Appreciate it. Let's do it again.
Yes, we will. And let me know when you're going to be in LA next.
Perfect. I'll do it.
Okay.
Talk to you soon, man.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, I want to give a huge thank you to everyone that tuned in and gave their time and attention. It was great. Special thanks to co-producer Daniel Pierce, show director Myra Rodriguez, and Chris Cooley, who wrote and performed all of the music that you heard today. Couldn't have done it without you three. Also want to tell all the listeners to please tune in next time when I interview Michael Ryan, who's going to tell us about clean energy, particularly Tesla technology. Fascinating years of study culminating in episode 2 that you don't want to miss. And also actor, improviser, and former political analyst Jim Shipley is going to debate some current issues with me, as well as share some inspirational wisdom with you. So we'll see you next time at the Populist Papers.